Well, first, let me follow in Bosco Peter's footsteps and say that for the second week in a row, Jesus is giving some pretty terrible public health advice. Last week, it was telling us not to wash our hands, and this week, he's spitting on someone's tongue. Now is not the time to be looking down at our WWJD bracelets and following Jesus' actions to the letter. I think if Jesus were around at the moment, he would be wandering the streets, steering us away from ivermectin and suggesting that hand washing, social distancing, mask wearing, getting a vaccine, and using a tracing app are pretty decent ways to love our neighbours. So let's stick with that rather than spitting on people's tongues for now. If you do wish to see someone get healed, as we should, I think sticking with prayer is a pretty decent option in these days. But it's not the second part of the gospel reading this morning that I want to focus on, but the first, the Syrophonician woman. It is a tricky, confusing, even potentially an offensive story. As we read it, it makes us sit up and question, this surely can't be the Jesus whom we know and love. This can't be right. It's a strange story that's created a great deal of commentary. And I want to give a brief overview of four interpretive camps that people tend to fall into. The first of those camps is to minimize or sanitize Jesus' words here. There's a sort of an invitation to it being about banter and body language, and it's not really as bad as you think. Essentially, they're saying, yes, Jesus does call her a dog, but he doesn't mean it like that. It's friendly repartee, and he can see that she's intelligent enough and clever enough to get some back and forth going. And there does seem to be some evidence for this interpretation. Dog is a commonly used term used by the Jews for the Gentiles. It could be said with some harshness or less. The Greek word that is being used here is a word for a little dog or a house dog or even a puppy. So it might be like me calling Edward a rat bag or a rapscallion or a wild thing. It might be said with a bit of jest and a bit of love to it. And body language might make a difference. Is there a smile or a knowing gesture or a cheeky glint in the eye from one or both of the parties in this encounter? Barclay, in his commentaries, thinks so. He puts it like this: we can be quite sure that the smile on Jesus' face and the compassion in his eyes robbed the words of all insult and bitterness. I have to say, though, I'm not utterly convinced by this interpretation. It may be right, but there are others who disagree. One commentator said it's true that the Greek term is a diminutive, but only a pet-loving Western culture would suggest that this reduces the offence. Little dog is no less unclean than a big one to Jesus' hearers. That's the first option, a friendly way of reading it, if you like. A second interpretive camp is that this is a test either for the disciples or for the woman herself. For the disciples, it asks, have they been paying attention? We know that this reading follows on from last week, where Jesus has declared things clean, saying that it's not the things that go into our bodies that make them unclean, but rather the things that come out from them. How are the disciples going to react to Jesus seemingly turning away this person who is deemed as unclean or other? That seems to be supported by Matthew's telling of this story, where the disciples are the first ones to hear the begging of this woman and come to Jesus saying, send her away, for she keeps crying out after us. Some have interpreted it as a test for the woman herself. Was she genuinely faithful? Is Jesus checking in as an opportunity for her to display her great faith for the benefit of the others around? Well, again, there might be some truth to this interpretation, though it's not fully satisfying to me. A third way of interpreting this is to shift the spotlight somewhat. to suggest that the story isn't primarily about Jesus, but rather, if we focus on the woman, there we find the most interest and the most teaching opportunity. Jesus' words then become not words of harshness, but words that are necessary for the flow of this story so that God's grace can ultimately be borne out. It's a new option or a new interpretation for me in the lead up to this sermon. And I have to say, there are some beautiful threads for contemplation in it. Here we see the woman being painted as a true follower. Firstly, as a prophet. Prophets in ancient times were not the fortune tellers as we might think of them, but rather they were a go-between, someone who stands in between God and represents God to the people and represents the people back to God. And this is precisely what she's doing with her daughter. She is the in-between, representing her daughter to the God in Jesus, and representing or debating with Jesus on behalf of her daughter. She's behaving like Abraham, one of the greatest of the prophets, who pleads for mercy in the case of Sodom. God says that he's going to wipe Sodom from the face of the earth, and Abraham comes back and pleads on the behalf of people. What if, Lord, there are 50 righteous people there? What if there are 45, 40, 30, 20, 10? Lord, can I persuade you to change your mind? So this woman is being a prophet. Not only, though, is she being a prophet, she is acting like the righteous of Israel. The story has striking similarities to the story of Jairus and his daughter. Likewise, they are pleading for a daughter. Likewise, there is a falling at the feet, which doesn't happen too many other times in Mark's Gospel. For her, the faith seems to be even stronger in that she is the only person in Mark's Gospel to call Jesus Lord. A fascinating a breadcrumb, I suppose we could call it, within the story. What great faith this woman shows. In fact, not only is she like Jairus as a man of importance in the synagogue, she is like Israel itself. Israel gets that name. Jacob is renamed as Israel after wrestling with God at the ford of the Jabbok River. This is key to the understanding of who Israel is. Israel are a people who wrestle with God. That's the meaning of the name Israel. I found that a fascinating interpretation for this reading, that here is a woman who becomes like Israel, who becomes like the faithful of Israel, who becomes like a prophet of Israel. Again, showing that it is the boundaries of God's grace are growing wider as people come and show their faith. There is a fourth option too, one that again I found fairly fascinating, and that is essentially trying to say that, well, Jesus was simply a bit grumpy. Theologian Sharon Ringe says he was caught with his compassion down, which is a lovely turn of phrase. And a lot of interpreters seem to avoid this line of questioning out of fear that they might inadvertently say that Jesus has somehow sinned, which is understandable, and I wouldn't want to say that Jesus has sinned. But I also like that this sense of maybe Jesus is grumpy and is in a place of exhaustion. It affirms his humanity. And I think in doing so, it allows us to accept our own human limitations when it comes to compassion as well. Jesus had left Galilee, he'd gone into a Gentile area, and whilst the story doesn't tell us explicitly, many commentators wonder whether it's for a sort of a retreat, a time away after an intensive period of fairly draining ministry. We're encouraged to do the same. The holy ones of God have always done the same. I was struck when touring Assisi to learn that St. Francis would spend up to a third of his year by himself living in a hermitage in the hills. That was not a lack of compassion on St. Francis's part, but rather a place of reconnection in order to be able to do that which God called him to do for the rest of his time. Does that going away, does that suggest something against the sinless nature of Christ? I don't think so. I think it might be okay that Jesus, at least while on earth, doesn't immediately offer to heal every person that he comes across. I'm always struck by that with the story of the pool of Bethesda rather, in John chapter 5. Everyone around this pool is hoping for healing, and that's why they're there. And Jesus goes into this place and chooses just one person to heal. That person hasn't asked for healing. That person hasn't affirmed a particular faith in Jesus. Jesus has simply graciously gone and healed one, and for some reason it seems left the others and moved on. Self-care is important, and if we're to live lives of compassion, we do need time away, time to refresh. So I'm not 100% convinced of this interpretation. In 3 years' time, when this reading comes up again, I might look back and call myself a heretic. But I think it does say something, and it speaks to our current global context. There is a lot going on in our world. There is a lot going wrong with our world. And because of 24/7 news cycles and alerts on our phones and social media, we are more aware of the fallenness of our world than anyone has ever been. That is a hard place to be. It is heavy, and we feel that heaviness. Many are writing on this experience of compassion fatigue. Some Canadian researchers gave this list of symptoms of compassion fatigue. I wonder if any of them ring true for you. Feelings of failure, guilt, self-doubt, sadness, and powerlessness. A loss of sleep. A reduced sense of efficiency on our job. Difficulty concentrating. Feeling overwhelmed with a sense of obligation. A sense of apathy or emotional numbness. Secretive addictions or self-medicating in a variety of ways. Isolation and withdrawal. Intrusive thoughts, dreams, or nightmares, and a sense of pessimism. I certainly can find myself giving a tick to a number of those. That might be a sign of compassion fatigue. And if we are to follow the way of Jesus, that can include a time away to focus purely on ourselves or on a relationship with Jesus. There are some horrifying statistics about the effect of all of this negative news on our mental state and our ability to carry the weight of all of this. I was particularly struck by a Facebook post from the retired Bishop of Dunedin, Kelvin Wright, who said a couple of days ago, "Right now I'm in a socially distanced queue, wearing a mask, waiting for the supermarket to open. It's closed till 10 because of the terrorist attack yesterday. Toto, I don't think we're in Kansas anymore." So I'm not quite sure exactly how to interpret today's reading, and that's okay. It's difficult, and we live in a complex world, and we have to get comfortable sitting in uncomfortable places. But let me leave you finally with another thing grabbed from Facebook, which is an affirmation that we wrestle with God and we wrestle with ourselves. And as we do that, we know that Jesus has been in this place with us and continues to be in this place with us. So let me just see if I can call up an image, share an image with you. I found this to be a great summation of that interpretation of our reading this morning. Things that can be equally true. You are resilient and you need a break. You gave your all and you need to back out. You are independent and you still need others. You were sure and things changed. You are kind and you have boundaries. Others have it worse and your pain is valid. You did your best and now you know more. I found those fairly life-giving words, and I pray that if that final interpretation of the gospel speaks truth, there is a place for time away to build our compassion. Then I pray that those words would speak to us. Spoken in the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.